Oh, here comes Tom. Leanne, can you just have a quick rattle out there and we're going to get started. So, please. So who's leading this? Ian? Okay. Alexandra for short. Yeah. Hey, Sandy. Righto. Hey, we're going to start this. Just for expediency, we're going to do these next two papers together, and then we'll move and second both of them at the end of the presentation. So the presentations flow through. The next two items will be dealt with concurrently. Thank you. So
Sandy will just get straight into it. Suggested that we just take questions throughout the presentation, just to allow things to carry on. A little bit of light stuff after those three heavy lifting items we've just come out of. So, Sandy.
NZEC guidelines. They're Australian. Sorry, the NZEC guidelines are Australian New Zealand guidelines that are developed for both countries and give guidelines on water quality standards.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon. I would like to start from the two pages. Closer. Okay. So the paper I would like to start with to introduce concerns the Tutaekuri and Ngaruroro catchments and is about nutrient limitation on algal growth. Here we are looking at a subset of algae, which is the periphyton. And periphyton are the algae that are attached to solid substrate like stones and gravel and logs in a stream. They are a natural component of a system and are the bottom of a food chain. But when the environment changes, it can come to prolific growth. And so if it reaches nuisance levels, then it compromises values like aesthetic values, recreational values, or it has an impact on ecosystem health. So therefore here we are interested in how fast algae grow and how often do they reach threshold values when it comes to nuisance levels. When do they actually start impacting our values, and for how long? What makes algae grow faster or slower? We've got several components here. One of the most obvious ones are light and temperature. Like plants, more light, higher temperature in a certain range makes them grow faster. Secondly, we've got flow and stable substrate. So the coarser the substrate, the more stable is the stream bottom. And if you've got a variability in flow, like magnitude and frequency, that determines how often the periphyton or the algae get flushed out of the river. After a flood flow, it starts growing again, and this is called the accrual period. This is the period over which algae grow and grow and grow and grow either into nuisance levels or stay below guidelines. And thirdly, we've got nutrients. There is enough of many nutrients for algae to grow, but naturally there are two nutrients that are fairly short in supply, and that is nitrogen and phosphorus. This is called that if you've got a shorter supply of nitrogen and phosphorus, they grow slower. The interesting part for the algae also is they need both of these nutrients in a certain ratio. So if one of those nutrients, phosphorus or nitrogen, is extremely short in supply, then also this slows down the growth of periphyton. What we did, we tested what happens and what is actually short in supply as nutrients of algae. And we did a miniature experiment where we put out nutrients in little bottles, and we looked at how fast algae grew on these little bottles where we put in nitrogen, phosphorus, both together or none at all. And we looked at the difference where we didn't have any nutrients added, that would be the normal stream water, and wherever we added something, did it grow faster or not? And like that, we could determine what is actually what would speed up algal growth. Looking at the background nutrients that we have in both catchments, we can see here that the Ngaruroro catchment has the upper half of it in native vegetation and forest. Out of this area, there's a pretty high volume of water coming with very low nutrients. From Whanawhana downwards, we've got predominantly pastoral farming and in very low proportion also other land uses. Here, the water that comes from the tributaries into the main stem of the Ngaruroro has fairly high nutrient concentrations. But since the upper catchment has a very high volume of water with low nutrients, this gets diluted. And in the Ngaruroro, the main stem of this river remains at very low nutrient concentrations throughout, from the headwaters to the sea. In the Tutaekuri, the upper catchment in the headwaters has a lower proportion of forest. This is again an area where the nutrient concentrations in the water is very low. The tributaries that contribute, again, similarly high concentrations of nutrients into the main stem of the Tutaekuri are large in proportion or in comparison to the forested upper catchment. So in the Tutaekuri, we see that the nutrients increase from the headwaters downstream to the sea. Our nutrient experiments for algal growth were put out here where you see the circles. The yellow circles show that we've got in each of the catchments a site in the upper catchment, which shows how do they grow and what is limiting the growth in just below the forested upper catchments. And then we've got also two sites in the lower catchment at Fern Hill in the Ngaruroro and Puketapu in the Tutaekuri, which captures the influence of the whole catchment. The squares show two sites that we have in the estuary, where we also trialed nutrient limitation for algal growth. In the results, we could see that nutrients were so low in the both upper catchments that growth was limited from both nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is called co-limited. We've got very low supply in phosphorus and nitrogen up there, and both is actually limiting the growth of algae. Further down in the catchment, we could still see co-limitation, so there is a very low supply, but there was some tendency towards N-limitation, and in the Ngaruroro it even switched over time, so we had several times the study out, and we had some co-limitation. Sometimes N was very low in supply, and sometimes phosphorus was very low in supply. Sorry, N is nitrogen and phosphorus. In the Waitangi estuary, could also observe mainly that both of the nutrients were low in supply, so we've got a co-limitation there as well. This means that if we increase nutrient in both of the catchments, it would mean that we'd increase algal growth rates, so they would grow faster. And that applies to both of the nutrients because we've got co-limitation here, both nutrients are very low, an increase would mean in nitrogen and phosphorus would mean algae would grow faster. In parallel to these studies, which were 9 weeks, we observed the periphyton cover on the stream bed. And you can see in this graph, the higher the line, the greater is the cover. So it starts from 0 and up on the top is 100% cover. And the both lower lines are the upper Ngaruroro and Tutaekuri, and we can see that the growth is very slow and covers only a maximum of 25% of the stream bed after 9 weeks. We have to add 2 more weeks because that was the last flood which cleaned out the river. So we've got an 11-week observance of how the algae grow. 11 weeks, that is almost 3 months. So we had an incredible long period where algae could grow. The upper 2 lines are the lower and the lower Tutaekuri and Ngaruroro, so we can see the algae grow faster there. To make it a bit easier, this is the summary with the numbers again. We can see after almost 3 months, the upper Tutaekuri, which is just below the forest in the low nutrient environment, stays excellent just with maximum of 5% cover. You just see a little bit of algae just really, it's very, very low. In the upper Ngaruroro, we've got, after 3 months, just below 25%. Whereas in the lower Tutaekuri and in the lower Ngaruroro, we see a faster growth, and there is a proposed threshold or guideline for periphyton cover, and that is 55%. This was reached after 8 weeks of growth in the Ngaruroro, and we can see that the Tutaekuri, because it has higher nutrient concentration, reaches this already after 5 weeks. So we can see that we reach the thresholds earlier where the nutrient concentrations are higher.
You have a graph that removes those two boxes to show us the top of that graph?
That was before that. Sorry, that was. So that was just the slide before?
It's the same slide.
It's the same slide, yeah. I just put the boxes because it's to put the summary on top.
The results, we can go back to that graph, the upper Tutaekuri is astonishing for no periphyton. Being a tramper and familiar with some of the more pristine areas, this time last year in the Ngaruroro, right up in the native forested catchment, it was absolutely a mat of periphyton. So what would the difference between the Tutaekuri and, say, is it substrate, is it flow, is it that one pristine river is not producing periphyton but another pristine stream actually has extensive cover of periphyton?
Yes, this is a very interesting question, and I think the difference here would be that we've got the Tutaekuri at Lawrence Hut has got pretty much 100% native vegetation. At Whanawhana, we already have a tiny influence of pastoral farming in the Taruarau. And what I think, especially if you deal with very low levels of nutrients, then the reaction can be very high in the beginning, especially when it's low flow. The periphyton mats will be so effective in getting nutrients out of the water. You measure very low nutrient concentrations, but they will be sucked and they out, and after 11 weeks you still have growth. So it really does depend if, say, a tree falls into the stream and decays, and even those will have a reaction on periphyton growth. I don't think that the substrate type will have an influence there, but every once in a while you do see, even in very pristine rivers, periphyton growth, especially after 3 months. It's just something we are, especially in Hawke's Bay, prone to. We've got extremely long accrual periods because we don't have, frequent floods that go through. We've got room temperatures and we've got sunshine, a lot of sunshine. So we have to always say we do have a risk of higher algal growth even under pristine or very good conditions. So just to summarize this, if we've got more nutrients, and in this case of the Tutaekuri and the Ngaruroro, this means nitrogen and phosphorus, we get faster growth. The thresholds that we set for our values will be reached earlier and maintained for longer, or we have more frequent breaches of our threshold. Do I have to summarize, or do I skip the summaries? Because it's basically what I said. Okay. So we move on to the life supporting capacity in lowland streams. This is moving on to a completely different catchment. We're moving from the hill country and gravel rivers and streams into the lowland, where we've got a very low gradient, which means that we've got slowly flowing water, which means that any sediment that comes in settles out quickly, and we've got a soft sediment stream, soft sediment bottom in the streams. These are ideal growing conditions for macrophytes, and macrophytes are very different from algae or periphyton we just talked about that attach to stones. In this case, they've got roots, and with that, they settle in the sediment, and they have the ability to grow into the stream channel and actually take up the volume of the stream if they are very prolific in growth. So the macrophytes that I'm talking about, they are, as opposed to the algae, they are real plants. They are aquatic plants with roots, stems, and leaves. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later too, why this is important. So in the Karamu catchment, we observed in the State of the Environment program that we have particularly low macroinvertebrate communities. So something is compromising ecosystem health here. The macroinvertebrate communities we are looking at consists of species of animals that can be very sensitive to the environment or indifferent or very tolerant. An index that is calculated from this community tells us what the proportion of sensitive species in a river is. And the MCI score for the Haratonga Plains was very low, particularly low. So something is stressing the environment here so much that we lose all the sensitive species. In this study, we wanted to find out if we can identify the stressors that cause these low macroinvertebrate communities that we have. We picked 16 sites. Most of them were in the Haratonga Plains, but we also moved outside of this catchment and had a couple of other lowland streams to have a broader range of environmental conditions. So what are the factors that are affecting stream life and could potentially turn into stressors? Of course, they need habitat, they need oxygen to breathe. We've got nutrients that may indirectly affect the macroinvertebrate community. Macrophytes grow. Sediment could potentially be a factor, pH, temperature, toxicants, and flow. All these factors were studied for this, all these factors were assessed during summer, and in parallel, we took samples of the macroinvertebrate community. There are statistical ways to relate these environmental variables with the abundances of the species that we found in the stream, and we can see how they relate to each other. So this is how we identified which of these environmental variables have the greatest impact if we lose some sensitive species. This analysis showed that the strongest factor were lack of habitat, lack of oxygen, and maximum stream temperatures, which caused the loss of sensitive species. The water in some of the streams was above 25 degrees, and oxygen was depleted daily, sometimes for several hours per day, or got to very, very low levels. Also, the habitat was lacking in some streams. So why do these three factors turn into stressors in the Haratonga Plains and in other lowland streams? First of all, the water heats up if the sunshine goes directly to heat up the water in the stream. Then a lot of those are channelized and have a very uniform channel and don't have a lot of suitable habitat to settle on. And then finally, the oxygen. There are actually several factors contributing to this. Oxygen in a stream increases through exchange with the surface and the air. So that depends on if water is agitated or turbulent in some way. And oxygen also increases in the water if our plants, the macrophytes, photosynthesize. So that brings oxygen into the water during daytime. On the other hand, you've got all the organisms in the stream that breathe, and they respire and use up oxygen. That's the fish, the macroinvertebrates, but also the plants. So during daytime, when they photosynthesize, you don't see how much oxygen they take up. But at nighttime, they don't produce oxygen anymore, and if there's a lot of biomass, then they take out the oxygen out of the water as well. And finally, you've got the sediment. If you've got a lot of organic material in the streams, the microbial breakdown of this uses oxygen as well. So you've got several factors that contribute to increase of oxygen in the water and to decrease. Now, what we saw in the Haratonga Plains is that we've got a high biomass of macrophytes in a lot of the streams. So a lot of these plants grow to such an extent that they practically fill the whole volume of the channel. In this case, we could observe extreme oxygen fluctuations of supersaturation during daytime and oxygen, very, very low oxygen levels at nighttime or in early morning hours. So the next step is the question, why do we have so much macrophytes in our streams? Because usually in the soft sediment streams, if you take a natural reference condition one, this would still be an important habitat, but they would grow slowly and they would form some islands and don't take up the whole channel. So the most important factors that affect plant growth are light, which strongly affects how fast the plants can grow. You've got the sediment, but that will be in lowland streams anyway. There, so that's predominant. You've got temperature, which makes it grow a bit faster, and the nutrients. One problem with the nutrients is that is different to the periphyton or the algae that we talked about before, because these are real plants. They've got roots in the sediment. So for these plants, they can take dissolved nutrients out of the water column, just like algae. But if that's slow, then they take them out of the sediment through their roots. So they do not respond so well on lower nutrient concentrations in the water column itself. So that is a big difference here. So this sums up the whole problem with our high temperatures, low oxygen, and lack of habitat. Now, one of the key tools for managing these three main problems that we identified here is riparian management. Riparian vegetation provides shade, so this helps to keep the water cool. Secondly, it slows down macrophyte growth, so that will actually reduce the oxygen sags that we observe. And finally, it provides habitat as well through roots, branches that hang into the stream, and undercut banks and other features that a riparian habitat would provide. Thank you.
So, thank you. So a question to Mr. Maxwell. So both 10 and 11, you're asking us to endorse, approve the report for publication, correct? So
Yes.
what we've just seen here basically explains what we'll see in the report.
Yes,
Okay.
so you have got a copy of the full report?
Yes,
Should
we
be
have got
undercover.
both those full
Yep.
report. And a few questions first. Yeah, sorry, Councillor Bevan, then Councillor Graham.
Oh, sorry, I preempted you. Thanks for your presentation. It's really interesting. I'm focused on solutions to algal management, and it seems that the principal one is around shade, right? Is it possible to model the benefits of shade? You can't put shade in the wide rivers like the Ngaruroro and so forth. You can only do it in the tributaries. And I have no idea what percentage of the water will come out of tributaries that we can actually shade. Are you able to model that and say, here are the benefits of doing X, Y, and Z?
There are several models that we could use. So that is definitely a way that would help to prioritize where we could start to suggest. And definitely that is a good approach to take as a next step.
So to augment Sandy's answer, there's a program of trials that Science and the Open Spaces Group are engaged in at the moment to consider the impact of various styles of shading on drains that we look after or control in various parts of the Karamu catchment and other catchments on the plains. And the intent here, for the benefit of committee, is to just help us identify what the options might be that work. And so we're looking at the angle of the sun, the angle of the drain, the thickness of the banks, the type of vegetation cover that we might use, and the other types of shading mechanisms that might be appropriate, things like shade cloth, for example. And what we expect to be doing in the next few months to perhaps a year or so is having some initial results from that to bring back to the table, and then to think about where we go from here as HBRC in the approach that we take to riparian management. What are the things that we might have in our toolbox? How does that work with the tank work program? And what sorts of tools would the community like us to be able to help them pick up and use?
Councillor Graham.
You may actually
back
have
to
answered
you.
my
That's
question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's a contradiction in terms. I live on a small contributory into the Karamu, the Algal, and it's not even listed here, it's so small. So the creek runs right through my place, and it's quite long. On the easterly side, it is well shaded, but the sun gets the entire day, basically, onto the creek. So we wanted to plant it up, and the regional council told us we couldn't plant within 4 metres of the creek. So I've planted big trees there, going to take a long time, but isn't that in contradiction with with what we're trying to achieve here and what we as the landowners were trying to achieve and do some good, and then we're told, and so the creek right down to the Karamu practically is just a drain now. It looks like a drain. Either side, hardly any planting on either side. And it's warm, polluted creek.
So it is an interesting challenge because obviously we have to manage some of these waterways for flood protection and water in excess times as well. So you're right that there are sort of competing demands in here. It's certainly something the engineering staff are focused on looking at alternative options. The shading troll that Stephen mentions is an option that looks to improve in-stream quality, but also has potentially management benefits by removing macrophyte masses without having to spray them or physically cut them out, so improving water movement during times of high flow. So the kind of green engineering principles are rapidly starting to be introduced into management practices. It's something that Napier City Council are particularly interested in as well at the moment. So it's kind of a growing body of work, and I think you'll probably find that in the pretty near future the way those systems are managed will be quite different to the way they are now. Looking for solutions, as Councillor Bevan says. Oh, look, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me that the engineers want to maintain some access along the banks to be able to dig them out and spray them and do the things they like to do. So those are the sorts of things we want to unpack and say, is that still required? Is there a better way of doing it that has these other additional benefits?
Clarification, it is 4 metres. I checked with Mr. Adey. My wife was very cross about it.
With Mr. Adey's number. I'm going to go Councillor Hewitt, then I'm going to come back to Councillor Pipe, actually.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandy. I'm concerned about the pesticides in the water and diuron from the construction sector and DDT from possibly an indoor drench treatment for apples. So surely that shouldn't be too hard to trace, and what are we doing about it?
Actually, this was just a backup for me for my study to see if there were any other factors, and I was surprised to find something like that. DDT is something that is extremely persistent in the environment, so that might have been decades ago that it came in, so we won't be able to trace that. The other findings we probably have to see to put it in the context as well, and I wasn't, since that was actually not the scope of my study, I did list the results, but I cannot provide any more answers. I would have to see what the threshold levels are, what this actually means, and yeah, that wasn't in the scope of this study. So,
Ian, is this something that concerns you, and will you be looking at it?
Well, I guess we're going to be guided by the work that Sandy does, and whether there is a need for us to flag up in the policy setting process that there is some issues with corresponding management or policy requirements to manage. I mean, as Sandy mentioned, some of these things like DDT are incredibly persistent, so we would need to figure out, well, what's actually happening now versus what's legacy, and what can we manage. So that's something that we would need to talk about as phase 2 of the study. I mean, there's also a whole suite of what we call emerging contaminants that are coming through. It's a whole field of research for some in the science community to deal with a growing list of chemical compounds that we're using in our healthcare products and our dishwashing liquids and all these other things that end up in our waterways. So it's a large issue for New Zealand Inc. to grapple with, and I guess we're waiting for the science to catch up to help us figure out, well, what are the things that we would want to manage and how would we go about doing that.
Councillor Pipe.
Thanks for the report. Lack of oxygen in the water seems to be one of the issues at certain times, of the year. Are there ways in which you can artificially introduce the oxygen, and maybe through the use of weirs or other ways? Has that been looked at all?
Can be looked at. It has to be considered carefully what else would change then. So it's definitely something that needs good thinking, because always you have you have to look at solutions maybe also elsewhere that have been trialed already, and I'm not really sure if artificial introduction of oxygen in the rivers would also, it would be a huge cost as well, depending on what you do. And the question would, if it would be easier just to slow down, really take the easy solutions of, say, well, we slow down macrophyte growth because that is our main trigger for this problem. But yes, definitely worth looking into other solutions as well.
Good one. Thank you for the report. Is there opportunity to copy that PowerPoint?
Sure is. I think we can provide that through, we'll send those out.
Thanks. Yeah.
Send out via email. So Councillor Scott, then Councillor Barker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Thank you for these reports. Is it possible to have your cake and eat it too? On the Raupari, there is a side agreement for enhancement. Has that actually started to make a difference, and is that difference measurable yet? And if I can turn it on its head, we've also looked at urban drains under the same multi-value outcomes. And have we actually thought to measure something like, which was a fairly controlled situation, the conversion of plantation drain into what is now Harakeke? Have we measured a before and after with that, and can we actually look at those results, which is looking at shading and riparian planting, etc., and changing the straight line to a...
Yes, we are just actually in the planning process for the open spaces Karamu enhancement project, where there's a lot of riparian plantings coming in, and looking into which are the best indicators, what is changing, and at what frequency we would have to measure that. So this is definitely going to happen, that we look over time at the changes that occur in the streams. So what we have to look at as well is not only the mitigation of these problematic factors, and prioritize where they are also relevant to change. So shading would not work on a very wide river, obviously, or you wouldn't expect change to be very quickly. So this is something that has to be thought through, and it is planned that we do comparisons of before and after.
Progressing?
There's no monitoring of the Raupari that I'm aware of, but the enhancement work that has been was put in place through that consenting process is underway. So that's gone into the open spaces team. They're working with the landowners there to get that work underway. And there's been, as I understand, quite a bit of work done on that.
Sorry, can I just follow that side, Mr Chairman? Wouldn't it not be helpful to that enhancement group to actually have a bit of monitoring, so they'd give them some feedback?
Certainly something we can consider and talk to them about.
Thank you. Councillor Barker.
Thank you for the report. Has it been known,
Microphone, please.
has it been known for a long time that shade is a critical thing for rivers? We've known that for a long time. And whilst I appreciate the comment made, we're going to do some investigation of types of shade and how we might do it, isn't it just a safe assumption to say some shade is better than none? And if you're going to come back with a report advertising and telling us more about the shading, wouldn't also be helpful for councillors to have some advice on what we currently expend on riparian planting so far, how much it currently does, and what we would need to invest to make a significant difference. Because it seems to me, just looking at the raw figures, that we're doing very little, and it's going to take an extremely long time to make any significant difference. So if we're going to make a change in this, it's going to require an enormous shift in resources and effort.
So shall I answer for you, Sandy? Because it revolves around cost-benefit questions, which I think is one of the key attributes of the exercise that we're engaged in at the moment, is to understand those very questions. If we spend X number of thousands of dollars, what benefit do we get from it? What's the most efficient way to do that? How do you configure your shade planting? What species might you use? What sort of shade cloth do you use? Which bank does it sit on? How effective is that? And that's designed to help us, as I said earlier, to provide the toolbox from which the people managing the creek or being involved in the creek can pick to get the best bang for their buck when they're investing it. And you're right, if we did everything on the Heretaunga Plains, it would be very expensive because we have a lot of waterways without shade at the moment. But there are lots of options both in the work that the tank group's doing and in the areas that we control as a council for us to invest wisely in the sort of management decisions we make and that others make to give effect to the idea of shade. And it's just helping people to get the right tools to do that that we're embarking on in the programme of work we're engaged in at the moment.
I'll ask a question. Out of frustration, I've seen what the Taranaki Regional Council has done over many decades, and they are looking at year-on-year constant improvements in water quality, and the riparian strips are planted almost all over the whole region, and here we are just about to take the first few tentative footsteps on the same path. I mean, that's my frustration, and I just think we need to rethink this more carefully and in fact do things rather than think about it a lot more.
Thank you. Councillor Belford.
As we make this, these two studies public, they'll be well read certainly by the tank group, and I just want to understand here, there's a sentence, for example, that says this means that any increase in N and or P could result in higher growth rates of periphyton, which could lead to more frequent and extended algae blooms in the Tutaekuri and Ngaruroro rivers. In the case of the Tugi, we made some effort to understand what the headroom might be. This statement doesn't give any sense as to, well, if you increase the load of either of these at all hell's going to break loose, or what actually is the implication of that sentence? Once a general person reads that, it makes it sound like any increase is going to accelerate this problem to some whatever degree. Is there headroom? Isn't there headroom for more N and P in these two rivers, or how should I read that?
Yes, first of all, this study was really about nutrient limitation, so I was looking at which nutrient is limiting, and I came to that conclusion. So I'm not giving any thresholds in this paper that tells us this is the amount of nutrients that will likely have a breach in our... This is the question that it would lead to. That's right. No, it's just simply saying that any increase in, so we don't have an extreme difference in the ratio, so we cannot say, well, actually only phosphorus is limiting algal growth. So this means that any increase in nutrients will lead to an increased growth rate. I'm not saying about, I can't estimate at this stage how much it will increase the growth rate, but this is just what is going to happen.
So the difference too, Councillor, just to help in that question, is that in the Tuki process we had the benefit of the NIWA MBIE funded nutrient work in collaboration with Cawthron, and they had built a specific model to take nutrient into the water and then turn it into algal biomass. So from that we were able to model and generate some scenarios around algal behaviour with nutrient inputs. We don't have that, so we certainly don't have the MBIE funded program. We don't currently have that sort of model for any of these catchments.
So what will be the approach then when assuming we have a tank process that proceeds here and they get to the point of, do we need tougher nutrient controls or regulation or not? How do we answer that question if we don't have that type of study being done?
Good question. So I guess that's kind of the next step that's being built into the model development for the groundwater model is taking contaminant flow and transport from the broader landscape and then putting it into the rivers and into groundwater and looking at how nutrient concentrations might change as a result of differing land use changes, whether you retain quo and look at what happens over a period of time with a lag to come or a load to come, whether you try and dial it back and what your corresponding nutrient concentrations will be in stream. At this point, what we would be using would be a guidance or an ANZAC type guideline, probably I suspect, to say the desire for managing or controlling nutrient growth in a co-limited stream is, let's say for argument's sake, 5 milligrams per litre. If you go above that, you've got a problem. If you stay below that, generally you're okay as a guideline, and then you can run some modelled scenarios to say, well, how much land use could you allow before you got there, or how much do you need it wind back to get there, depending on where you are in the catchment. So the groundwater model informs that discussion, but otherwise the thresholds would be set in the absence of a detailed model that grows periphyton-like trim, would be set through taking some guideline values and probably using expert panels, so pulling together people who are experts in this field and saying, given this catchment, its characteristics and its behaviour, what are the recommended thresholds to apply? And that's the way that we would typically deal with it.
Bear with me, just a last question on that. You referred to the trim thing, which was a matter of huge controversy, as it turned out. Here we're talking about a much more valuable catchment in economic terms, and it's impossible for me to imagine that the issue would not come up of what's the load-bearing capacity, let's say, of the Ngaruroro River in terms of NNP, and that we would have to have some pretty reliable basis for addressing that issue and putting in place any restrictions that might be required if they were.
Sure, and you're right, it was the trim model, and as you pointed out, it was a model of great controversy, enormous controversy, and there is basically no appetite to entertain that sort of exercise again, simply because the complexities of modelling systems like that are difficult. We had the value and the benefit of a government-funded program of study over many years to draw on a model to pick up and use. I would hazard a guess that if that wasn't available, that work would not have been carried out in that catchment.
Corona.
Just going back to the implementation of plants within the creeks and waterways, has it been looked at in hindsight of planting watercress within those areas, because that's something that gives quality back to the water itself, and also it can be of value in regards to a resource within the Māori community.
Yeah, that is a good point, and we have quite a few of the streams that do have watercress in it.
Okay.
Move the
No further
recommendation.
question? You're happy to move 10 and 11 of this? You're happy to move both of them concurrently? You're happy to second that? Wish to speak further, Councillor Dick? Further speaking,
I'd
Councillor
like to
Scott?
thank the staff for 2 really excellent reports, Mr Chairman. I hope we adopt these reports, and I would like to think they'll be circulated then immediately to the tank stakeholders, because they are going to be of much interest to them as well. So thank you very much for such good reports.
Further speakers? Put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no.